Hello, my name is David Callett, and I'll be taking you on a guided tour through F.W. Murnau's City Girl, one of three pictures Murnau directed for producer William Fox. I'm taking for granted that you've already seen City Girl. However, I need to say up front, I'm also taking for granted that you have seen Murnau's Sunrise. Not only because Sunrise is an important landmark in world cinema that any self-respecting cineast should visit at least once, but because there's no proper way to account for City Girl's legacy without putting it into context alongside Sunrise. This is a movie that too easily gets lost in the shuffle. City Girl is a film that falls between two stools, whereas Sunrise gets all the love for being an unqualified classic and a rare moment of true artistic independence in commercial Hollywood, and Taboo was an innovative experiment in which Murnau collaborated with another headstrong artist and then died after making the film. The movies he made between Four Devils and City Girl, they kind of disappear into the fog. Four Devils at least has the mystique of being a lost film, but City Girl seems to have no special hook. The woman eyeing Lem is played by Helen Lynch. She looks suspiciously similar to Mary Livingstone's character from Sunrise, as if on her return trip to the city she ended up on the same train as this character, the first hint that this film is going to have Sunrise on its mind. Lem's introduction on the train as a rube with a bankroll whose unwary attitude towards his money makes him a mark for the attention of a grafter is a familiar slapstick setup. For example, a remarkably similar scene opens the short comedy Lucky Stars by Harry Langdon. Both Sunrise and City Girl repeatedly invoke situations that in the hands of slapstick comedians would often be played for laughs, but which Murnau treats either dead seriously or with at most a very light comic touch. Murnau's relationship to these comic elements is something about which we are uncertain. It's generally the tendency of critics who write about Murnau's films to identify the comic elements as something imposed on Murnau against his wishes by the studio in an effort to Americanize and popularize his films. For example, Lottie Eisner specifically writes of City Girl that, quote, once more comic scenes had to be put in, and the gag men were set to work. However, being the contrarian that I am, I do have to voice some dissent here. As I just said a moment ago, Sunrise is a catalog of slapstick situations, although they're mostly played straight. More so than City Girl, the cast of Sunrise is full of veteran comedians. Arthur Houseman, Ralph Sipperly, Sidney Bracey, Gino Corrado, Eddie Boland. And then there are actual jokes, the wedding reception mistaking the peasant couple for the bride and groom, the business at the photographer's and the headless statue, the comic misunderstandings at the saloon, a drunken pig, for God's sake. Lottie Eisner suggests that these tawdry jokes were inserted by Fox gagmen, and Murnau was obliged to go along with them. But Sunrise was famously made without studio interference, and even after his falling out with Fox, Murnau never said that Sunrise was anything other than a work of total creative freedom. The thing is, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't say that Murnau had total creative freedom, but he also had to tolerate jokes inserted into the script against his will. If Sunrise was Murnau's vision, his vision was prone to flirt with comedy. Now might be the time to note, that The Last Laugh has its own comic elements too, in which a grim story comes to a tragic end and then reboots itself as a comedy for its final reel, inspiring the English language title. The thing is, cineasts try to have their cake and eat it too with Murnau all the time. In looking at his Hollywood films, critics want to assign him full credit for everything that sparkles with artistry, but any element that falters is said to be the result of studio interference. What you end up with is a situation where Murnau can do no wrong. He's responsible for everything good, but absolved of blame for anything bad. This is, of course, ridiculous, and as a fan of slapstick comedy, I see nothing degrading or improper about the inclusion of such material in high art, so I feel no need to rationalize its presence here. This shot of the Chicago Board of Trade, or its studio recreation equivalent, cannot help but bring to mind for me the stock market sequence from Fritz Lang's 1922 Dr. Mabuse the Gambler, with a similar blackboard and a frantic figure scratching out ever-changing tallies in chalk while speculators look on in desperation as their fortunes are destroyed. We will transition from the Board of Trade scene back to the farm, where Father Tustine, played by David Torrance, demonstrates how much he values his wheat, and I don't just mean numbers. The numbers are abstract figures, but to him, wheat is the result of his own hard work. Each blade of grain is precious. He can't even abide letting his daughter play with any. David Torrance was a Scottish actor who, along with his younger brother Ernest, immigrated to Hollywood to pursue a movie career. He spoke German well, which probably helped him on Murnau's set. Torrance had authority, a real projection of power, and over the course of his career was often cast as an authority figure. By the by, Torrance would get his slapstick comedy credentials a few years later in the Laurel and Hardy film Bonnie Scotland. Here, he convincingly embodies a Bible-thumping farmer. It's a terrific performance, and arguably his best. The way the film now stands, this moment with gruff Tustine admonishing, threatening even a child, serves to establish his character as a dour sort, and we will find the rest of the film working off of this characterization of him as mean and heartless. But the way the film was originally conceived would have presented this material with a slightly different spin. The title of the film was planned to be Our Daily Bread. In a moment, Tustine will say that phrase in an intertitle. The first draft of the script shuffled the farm scenes together with the Board of Trade, with lots of back-and-forth cross-cutting to juxtapose Tustine reading his Bible, scenes of his farm and its harvest depicted as illustrations of Bible verses, and all this salt-of-the-earth tradition spliced with scenes from Chicago's modern machine-age lifestyle. A fleeting fragment of that idea remains, in which Tustine says his prayer and takes up his loaf of bread, vital sustenance he created with his own hands, and as he slices the thing by hand, the scene dissolves to an industrial bread slicer, mechanically parodying his actions at the Chicago diner where Kate works. The fundament of his life is something that in the city they take completely for granted. These two different attitudes towards bread and nature was to have been a central pivot point of the story. Blink and you'll miss him there at the end of the counter. There we go, right at the far right of the screen. That's Eddie Boland. In Sunrise, he played what the credits called the obliging gentleman, the man at the Luna Park dance who kept adjusting the dress straps of the woman standing in front of him. It was one of the more ostentatiously comic moments from Sunrise, so you may not be surprised if I note that Boland had been a slapstick comedian on the Hal Roach lot in the previous decade. He'd been hired by Hal Roach in an effort to groom a replacement for Harold Lloyd, whose brand of slapstick thrills and romantic comedy realism was such a precious mix it was hard to find the right man to fill the shoes. Boland never quite made it work. He was a heavy drinker, as were a lot of slapstick comics, as it happens, and in a short time seemed to age precipitously. Along with a bevy of washed-up slapstick comics, he took work at the Fox lot in bit roles. This business with the fan is, like the bread slicer, another mechanical parody of outdoor life. Here in the city, indoors, there is no breeze, so they make an artificial breeze with metal and wires and then fight over it. Throughout this first half of the film, Murnau is carefully building up the case that city life is by definition an alienating force that disconnects people from the earth. And then in the second half, he will go about exploding those myths. The wide-eyed waitress working with our heroine, Mary Duncan, the woman there on the right, is played by actress Marjorie Beebe, another of the slapstick comedy refugees littering the cast of this picture. The farm boy chic embodied by Lem is a classic American folk myth, the honest, upstanding farm boy representing all that is decent and good in the world as opposed to the selfishness of the urban lifestyle and the cynicism of the women who live in it. It's Lois Lane and Clark Kent. Murnau referred to Lem as a yokel, but while he may be simple, he's also painfully earnest. He loves his mother, he's polite to strangers, he never yields to temptation, he's almost impossibly perfect. And this remains a stubborn fixture in the American mindset. Reflexively, Americans almost unconsciously accept that people from small towns and a more rural lifestyle are by nature more honest, moral, decent people compared to the slippery city folk with their debauched sense of fashion and art and commerce. In the 2008 presidential election, Sarah Palin exploited that stereotype to political advantage. Because this cultural split between country life and city life remains so much a part of the American mindset, quite naturally it has been a ripe topic for drama. Thus, the idea of a city woman marrying into a life on a farm became a popular notion on American screens. In just the few years clustered around production of this movie, there were at least 3 other notable studio productions with the same underlying plot. The Canadian in 1926, White Gold in 1927, The Wind in 1928. That was released while Murnau was shooting this picture. For that matter, if you want to see the continued appeal of the idea, just check out reruns of Green Acres. Now, the story was not an original plot devised by Murnau, nor was it crafted by Carl Mayer, the legendary screenwriter whose collaboration with Murnau had come to an end during the early phase of their previous film, The Four Devils. Instead, this was adapted from a stage play called The Mud Turtle, written by Eliot Lester. But before you conclude that the heavy preponderance of intertitles throughout this film is a consequence of being adapted from a play, let me note that Lester's stage version is exclusively set at the Tustine farm. All this stuff in Chicago was added to the screenplay specifically for the movie. Eliot Lester's The Mud Turtle premiered at New York's Bijou Theater on August 20th, 1925. And it ran for 52 performances. It was never an especially popular production, nor was it enthusiastically received by critics. It was revived in 1947, and once again was met with a fairly chilly critical reception that noted that while Lester had created a nicely dramatic situation, it was also one plagued by plausibility problems. Lester continued to try his hand as a Broadway playwright, but never with much success, and eventually settled into a more comfortable life as a prep school teacher in Philadelphia. He's also the father of filmmaker Richard Lester. But long before Richard Lester was even a gleam in his daddy's eye, Eliot Lester took a job at a Hollywood movie studio, and as fate would have it, the studio in question was Fox. Thus, Lester and Murnau met in 1926, and he brought his play to Murnau's attention. "Gee, Mr. Murnau, won't you take a look at my play? It's about a wheat farm." And so it came to pass that in December of 1927, with Sunrise just barely in theaters across the states and with Four Devils still in pre-production, Murnau sent a cable to William Fox that said, quote, "I should like to make a picture named Our Daily Bread. A story that will tell a tale about wheat, about the sacredness of bread, about the estrangement of the modern metropolitans from and their ignorance about nature's sources of sustenance." Conveniently, the studio had just bought the play The Mud Turtle and had already filed a screenplay adaptation by Willis Goldbeck. However, rather than use that existing script, Murnau had the play translated into German by Hermann Bing, and then sent it to Germany to his screenwriters Bertold Viertel and Marion Orth. Viertel and Orth were the two who had finished the screenplay for The Four Devils when Carl Mayer left. It is always tough to sort out who did what in a film. It's a conversational convenience that we fall into to identify the director as the principal author of a movie, and screenwriters are rarely given the attention and recognition they deserve. In the case of F.W. Murnau, it's an interesting coincidence that those films we consider most representative of Murnau, the ones we think of when we think of him, tend to be the ones written by Carl Mayer, whereas those films that seem atypical are the ones written by others, which I take as a pretty good sign that a lot of what we tend to identify as Murnau's signature touch is actually the result of his collaboration with the mercurial and dark Mr. Mayer. The fabled lack of intertitles in The Last Laugh, for example, is not a feature I feel comfortable saying is a Murnau touch. Whatever he might have been saying in essays and manifestos, Murnau's life's work does not show a steady progression towards a goal of pure visual storytelling. And as Stanley Solomon notes in his book The Film Idea, the fact that The Last Laugh managed to dispense with intertitles could just be because Mayer had written a simple-minded story that lent itself to that kind of approach. The additional titles that we find here merely reflect a more complex narrative. Instead of focusing just on illustrating one man's psychological state, we have a web of characters caught in a dramatic matrix. Murnau's signature expressionist touches, such a distinctive feature of films like The Last Laugh and Sunrise, are rarely to be found in this more Spartan and realistic production. In one of the rare expressionist flourishes of this film, the camera's sudden retreat visualizes how Lem feels swallowed up by the city, overwhelmed by bad news. He feels very small, so he gets small in the frame, and then the camera actually loses sight of him. He has to walk back into the frame to reassert himself into an image that no longer finds him relevant or necessary. It's the common and most obvious reading to see this film as an inverse of the morality of Sunrise. Why, it's even signaled in the title. We've gone from Sunrise's corrupting woman from the city to City Girl, a direct reference. But unlike Sunrise's selfish woman from the city, City Girl brings a similar figure into a similar rural setting where she proves herself to have a deeper moral core than anyone else. The thrust of the first half of the film is initially to set up the contrast between the honest values of country life with the decadence of modern city life, so that then the second half of the movie could dismantle that myth. And so in the service of demonstrating the inhospitable lifestyle of Chicago, we get this striking set piece. Kate stares longingly at pictures of the countryside while trapped in a prison of glass and concrete. When she comes home, it's not even to a place she can call her own, a rental space constantly invaded by the roar of the passing L train or the glow of neon signs outside. She vainly tries to grow a plant on her windowsill, but it's a soot-covered thing with no sight of the sun. The closest thing to life she has in her apartment is a mechanical bird in a cage, as alarming a metaphor as you could ask for. There's a subtle and probably unintentional irony at work in this sequence. Although these scenes were to have been shot on location in Chicago, and a studio scout had spent April of 1928 traveling through Chicago and the Midwest choosing locations, when the time came, the production team decided instead to mount this in a Los Angeles studio. So the irony is, when we consider how the film keeps drawing parallels between the authenticity of farm life and the artificiality of city life, it isn't just that city folk have fake birds and fake breezes, it's a whole fake city. Not only was the Chicago material added to the script for the movie version of the play, but it was appended to the end of the shoot as well. The first stage of production was filming on location in Oregon these exteriors of the Tustine farm. Because stars Charles Farrell and Mary Duncan, as well as cinematographer Ernest Palmer and set designer Harry Oliver, were all being shared with director Frank Borzage on his film The River, Murnau had to wait until they finished work there before he could drag them out to Oregon to get started on his project. When in mid-August that moment finally came, Murnau was himself sidelined by a ruptured appendix. He was recovering from surgery and had to let work start without him. According to reports published at the time, William Tummel substituted for Murnau while he recovered. And of course, by the time all was said and done, quite a few people other than Murnau would have sat in the director's chair on this movie, as we shall talk about shortly. Now, there is a temptation to say too many cooks spoil the soup, and indeed, a fair number of critics do write this film off as being not just lesser Murnau, but being bastardized Murnau, hybridized Murnau. I have to say that what we have before us in this film represents such a coherent artistic vision, so crammed with powerful ideas, expressed with great cinematic sophistication, that I don't consider it second-rate at all. We can get too wrapped up in the idea of creative autonomy for its own sake that we blind ourselves to the extent to which filmmaking is fundamentally a collaborative endeavor in which the history of the form has presented us with proof that personality clashes and creative disagreements can easily lead to great art. A great visionary artist leading his or her team on a straight-line path towards the realization of their vision is one way of creating a great movie, but it's not the only way. In an essay he wrote in 1928 for Theater magazine, Murnau explained he preferred to work with relatively young and not especially experienced actors. He wanted them to be established enough not to be incompetent greenhorns, but he wanted to avoid the way big stars came with established screen personas and difficult egos. He'd worked with Mary Duncan already on The Four Devils, in which she played the femme fatale character that Papa Tustine wrongly assumes her to be in this film, so Murnau and Duncan already had a good working relationship. Charles Farrell, who plays Lem, was still a relatively unproven commodity who would, in the years to come, establish himself as a fairly big star of the early talkie era. He would be paired with Janet Gaynor as a screen couple in a series of romances whose popularity would end up being influential in getting this film released. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This is a much more American-seeming film than Sunrise. Murnau was getting a better feel for American culture, and his depiction of the settings and the people has finally shaken off those old-world inflections. It's a shame this would be his last American film, Taboo Doesn't Count, because it would have been interesting to see how he would have continued in an American idiom. Fritz Lang adapted to Hollywood and made extraordinary films that were easily the equal of his German work. Ernst Lubitsch truly came into his own in the United States and became one of the most significant German émigrés in Hollywood. What tripped Murnau up wasn't adapting to American culture, and it wasn't finding his place in the Hollywood studio system. As we can see, he mastered these things. It was the arrival of sound. A little later in this track, I'll talk about how the advent of talking pictures proved to be the one thing that knocked Murnau off his pedestal as one of the greatest film directors in the world. Now here's something interesting. We did not see Lem sell his wheat crop. We only hear about it afterwards. Nor will Murnau show us the wedding between Lem and Kate. Weirdly, the two most significant single events in Lem's time in Chicago are left off-screen. However, from Lem's perspective, I'm not sure it's right to say that those events are the most important thing that happens to him in Chicago. Actually, the most significant experience he has in Chicago is meeting Kate and falling in love with her. It completely overshadows the sale of the wheat. Kate, who's our main character, the title character at that, has nothing to do with the wheat sale, and her perspective is entirely about her encounters with Lem at the lunch counter. The only time the camera wanders away from the lunch counter is not to follow Lem, but to follow her home. The relationship that she forges with Lem is created in these scenes at the diner. It's not something established in the wedding ceremony itself. One wedding's very much like another, a point Murnau had already made in Sunrise, when his peasant couple sit in the back row of a stranger's marriage and treat the experience as if it was their own wedding. In the second part of the movie, the stresses that will be brought to bear on Lem and Kate's relationship will hinge on how much trust and respect they've developed with one another. In other words, it will hinge on what's happened here, in small moments like these, and not on any detail of saying their vows. The really important stuff of the first half of the movie takes place here. Whatever transpires at the Board of Trade or the Justice of the Peace is merely routine formality. This shot of Kate's legs is the first of two such images, which Murnau mirrors as a way of demonstrating that her life on the Tustine farm isn't so different or much better than life was here. It's interesting to look at shots like this, or the opening of Sunrise, or the seduction scene in Tartuffe, and take note of the fact that the one aspect of female anatomy that F.W. Murnau knew how to visualize erotically was legs. I've been dancing around the issue of Murnau's creative control, when he had it, when he didn't, for some time now. It's time to give you some specifics. As I've already said, Sunrise was made under unfettered creative freedom on the part of Murnau, and although the version of the Four Devils that ultimately reached theaters had been substantially tampered with, those changes were made to that film only after Murnau had quit. And in fact, the Four Devils was originally completed under the same conditions as Sunrise. As Janet Bergstrom has noted in her article Murnau in America, internal studio communications and interviews with the staff of Four Devils confirms that it was Murnau's baby all the way. Director of photography Ernest Palmer, editor Harold Schuster, and star Janet Gaynor all complained on the record about the stresses put upon them by Murnau's perfectionism. Press coverage at the time made much of Murnau's freedom. And it's also worth noting that given that freedom, Murnau chose to exercise it in a way that was collaborative with Fox, not combative. He actively sought Fox's input on the story during its development. He conscientiously scaled back on his ambitions out of respect for keeping the budget down after the excesses of Sunrise. And we should note that Murnau went to theaters to sit in on screenings of Sunrise with paying audiences so he could secretly observe the American public's response. Although Sunrise was getting enormous critical praise, the box office was disappointingly poor, and Murnau was shaken by seeing the prickly response of crowds. It wasn't studio pressure on him to change to meet American audience expectations. When Murnau went ahead with The Four Devils, he was trying to make those adaptations of his own volition because he wanted to. Through the early stages of work on City Girl, then still identified as Our Daily Bread, Murnau was displaying great enthusiasm for working for Fox and an eagerness to help build the fortunes of the company. Let's put some dates to it. In 1926, William Fox signed Murnau to a contract covering but a single work, Sunrise. In 1927, after the completion of Sunrise, but before it had been shown to anyone, Fox and Murnau discussed a new contract. This was not made in response to any audience reaction or critical review or box office income report. It was just two men evaluating how well they thought they'd work together, and they wanted to continue. Fox signed Murnau to a new deal covering 4 more films. Now, later historians writing the story of Murnau's time in Hollywood would sometimes accidentally conflate these 2 separate contracts into one, mistakenly concluding that Murnau had been signed to a 5-year contract, out of which 3 films were made: Sunrise, Four Devils, and City Girl. In fact, when Murnau voided his contract in February of 1929 and walked off the set of the unfinished City Girl, he had not yet completed the second of his 4 films for the new contract. Murnau's untampered-with original edition of The Four Devils had been shown in October of 1928. It had made it that far without yet falling afoul of meaningful studio interference. Yet not 4 months later, Murnau decided this partnership was no longer salvageable, and he departed. It was only at this point, only after he quit, that Four Devils was transformed from the silent tragedy Murnau had crafted into a part-talkie film with a happy ending. In other words, what went wrong entirely during work on City Girl, and seems to have been concentrated towards the end of 1928. So what was it? What happened? Well, wouldn't you like to know? That is, of course, the big question. We are going to be coming back to that repeatedly over the remainder of this commentary. Hold that thought in your mind. We've got some other stuff to talk about first. It is a familiar piece of rom-com iconography to have a pair of lovers separating and one goes rushing after the other to stop them at the, fill-in-the-blank, train station, boat harbor, airport, what have you. This is a classic genre paradigm, even when this movie was made, and continues to drive romantic comedies today. Tickets dominate this first part of the film, and Lem has a lot of fumbling with train tickets. Where is his train ticket? Does he want to get it stamped or not? Lem also relies on tickets to pay for his meals at the diner. Curious coincidence, don't you think? On top of that, it is this fortune-telling ticket that he's about to receive that serves as a symbol of his relationship with Kate, such that what happens to the ticket and who has it seems to have actual relevance to the relationship itself. It's an almost superstitious token. It's also a physical link to this early courtship that they can take with them into the darkness of the latter half of the movie, an efficient visual symbol from a cinematic point of view. A lot of concepts in this film get reduced down to paper surrogates. Lem discovers the falling price of wheat not by engaging in selling it, but by reading it in a newspaper article. His family first learns of Kate from a postcard. Lem doesn't tell his father what the final sale price was, that he just shows him a receipt. Kate's most significant action in the film will not be depicted directly, but referenced secondhand by a letter she leaves for Lem. Film theorists of the early 20th century were trying to figure out what relationship the audience had with the point of view represented by the camera. There was an existing body of scholarship and analysis of literature, and a perhaps unfortunate habit of trying to map that kind of literary analysis onto this new media. In a novel, you can have a variety of points of view, an omniscient third-party voice describing events, or a first-person narrative told from the perspective of a particular character. Grafting this onto film, the notion was that most movies are presented in the cinematic equivalent of a third-party voice, in which the objective camera shows events from a privileged perspective. Therefore, the logic went, in order to have a cinematic equivalent of a first-person narrative, the camera would be in place of that person's eyes. The audience would perceive the story as if they were that character. There were a few experiments along these lines, ranging from a few isolated first-person scenes at the start of Robert Mamoulian's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde to the entirety of Robert Montgomery's Lady in the Lake. These experiments didn't work as intended. Eventually, film theorists would come to understand that the first-person and third-person points of view were not things that could be equated simply with the camera's position. And in fact, the audience was far more likely to identify themselves with actors they could see. The weird gimmickry of Lady in the Lake actually prevented viewers from identifying with Philip Marlowe, not imagine themselves to be him. Murnau understood this essential facet of film far before the theorists did. Earlier I noted an expressionist tracking shot that crushed Lem into the margins of the frame. Here is the twin of that shot reversed. This time the figure lost in the crowd is Kate, dejected and small, but the camera moves, not to crush her, but to reunite her with Lem. Brought back together, these two are then enlarged in the frame. Two people who find each other in the anonymous crowd. It is as subjective a use of the camera as you could want, but the figures, plural, whose point of view is depicted, are also seen in the frame. Whereas Murnau's artistry had previously been typically represented in his brilliant compositional sense and mastery of mise-en-scène, this film finds him working more in the realm of montage. Think of Sunrise for a moment, and some of its most memorable moments jump out. That extraordinarily long take of Janet Gaynor sitting in the boat, the slow play of mixed emotions fighting their way across her face. Or the shot that comes so soon after it as she and George O'Brien ride the trolley to the city in a lengthy take that travels across a changing landscape. There's none of that kind of long take indulgence here, where some of the most striking and memorable moments unfold as sequences of shorter shots. Instead of unveiling the emotions of his characters here in a single shot whose purpose is to let the actors' faces do all the work, here Lem's marriage proposal is conveyed through a nervous stutter of short bits. This was a new direction for Murnau. Editing had not been one of his strengths before. In fact, the man wore his prejudices on his sleeve rather obviously. Murnau wasn't his name. He was born Wilhelm Plump. Murnau was the name of a rural village near Bavaria that was home to an artists' colony with the likes of Vasily Kandinsky. He so much wanted to identify himself with that place, he took it as his name. The films he would make under that name would display an uncommon familiarity with painting, not just the modernist style of Kandinsky, but the channeling of the old Dutch masters. So here's a guy who's chosen to more or less call himself Mr. Countryside, and would repeatedly in his films pay tribute to the glories of country life. He makes a film, Sunrise, with the in-your-face point that country life is superior to city life, and then on its heels, he goes and makes a film that says, oh no, just kidding. Well, that demands an explanation. But when you look at the totality of Murnau's cinema, several recurring themes appear, one of which is his love of the countryside, but another one, equally important, is the idea of an intruder who destabilizes a family unit. The intruder can take various forms: Nosferatu the vampire, or Tartuffe the religious hypocrite, revolutionaries inciting rebellion against a decent government, a selfish woman from the city, a Jezebel trying to undermine a family of acrobats. Papa Tustine assumes that Kate is a gold-digging hussy, and he perceives her as a threat to his fragile family farm. He sees that word waitress, and he just thinks he's got her pegged. However, this film gives us two intruders for the price of one. From Tustine's vantage point, the intruder is Kate. But if we take the position that the family unit being threatened isn't the farm, but is Lem and Kate's marriage, we will find it under attack from farmhand Mac. We'll talk more about Mac when he is actually introduced into the story, but here I wanted to point up the delicate interconnection between these two forces. The only reason Mac has an entree to Kate is because Tustine has been so mean to her and driven such a wedge between her and Lem. Yet Tustine sees Mac's attentions as proof that he was right to distrust her. It's a feedback loop, with the two destabilizing forces enhancing each other. Fox's studio was, at this time, developing a widescreen process that they called grandeur film. It was a 70mm format, much like the 70mm widescreen formats that would become popular a few decades later. When Murnau heard about this, his first reaction was to say, hey, wouldn't it be great for Our Daily Bread to be the inaugural film of this new grandeur format? He realized that the vistas of the wheat fields would look fabulous in widescreen. In the end, as you can plainly see, they didn't do that. The grandeur format was instead first used on some newsreel shorts, and the first grandeur feature was the musical Happy Days in 1930. But even so, the location photography in these Midwestern landscapes is indeed one of the great strengths of this motion picture. And I mention it here as yet another little piece of evidence that as work began on this film, the working relationship between Murnau and the studio was very positive and mutually supportive, and Murnau was keen to explore new cinematic techniques and technologies. This is supposedly set in Blair, Minnesota, and the location scouts had initially looked in Minnesota on the premise that literal realism was a value, but in a cost-saving measure, they decided instead to shoot in Athena, Oregon, near Pendleton. The cast and crew were lodged in Pendleton, had to commute 45 miles each day to get to the farm set. In his Index to the Films of F.W. Murnau, Theodore Huff said that the studio actually bought a whole wheat farm. This is an exaggeration. As it happens, the truth almost sounds like one of those old Hollywood jokes. They bought an apple orchard, tore up the apple trees, and planted wheat. Well, why didn't they buy a wheat farm? The staff was told to make a point of planting it right up to the farmhouse door to show how Tustine wasn't going to forego a single grain. After the shoot, they sold the wheat, by the way, waste not, want not. Now, as our lovers make their way to their new home, in one of the most famous shots of the movie, the film is going to take an important turn. This is where the play begins, for one thing, such that the preceding half-hour prologue was added for a reason. The film is a clash between two stereotypes. Kate has her stereotyped fantasy of farm life. Tustine has his stereotype of her. When these two are brought together, the darkness begins. The film is not just changing location from Chicago to the farm, not just passing from prologue to the heart of the play. It's coming up on the essential conflict that drives us, and there is a hesitation in Lem's run. He lingers at the outskirts of the farm. The joy with which he's been racing to introduce his new bride to his old family is tempered by fear, an unspoken realization of what is in store. He lingers, and the story is ready to kick into gear. Speaking of kicking stories into gear, we do have a mystery on our hands that we do need to return to. I've already laid out for you the chronology to show you that Murnau's genuine creative freedom at Fox existed into 1928 and then fell apart rather suddenly, but we still need to address why. Now, for some, that question does seem to answer itself. I mean, when you find an orchid improbably growing in the Arctic tundra, you don't trouble yourself to ask why it dies. It wasn't supposed to be growing there in the first place. Thus, since Murnau's artistic freedom in commercial Hollywood was an unlikely thing to begin with, its end was foreordained. But if I found an orchid growing in the tundra, my first question would be, how'd it get there? And if we stop to ask how Murnau and Fox came together in 1926, why Fox ever even offered him his freedom, we will find the key to unlocking the mystery. So let's start by asking this question. Why did Murnau take the offer? In Germany, at Ufa, Murnau had made things like Nosferatu and Faust, The Last Laugh, with total creative freedom, surrounded by arguably the most fecund crop of filmmaking talent the world has ever concentrated in one place. He was at the most prestigious studio with the most prestigious producer and a roster of collaborators to make your mouth water. Why give that up? The German film community was terrified by the thought that the obvious answer to that question was that he was going to sell out. Hollywood was where the money and the glamour are, and they worried Murnau was letting himself be seduced by those allures like so many other great luminaries of German cinema. One by one, their best and brightest were being poached by their chief competitor, and if Murnau were going to go make great films for Hollywood, not only would the German cinema lose his talents, but they'd then find him competing against them. So some German critics wrote reassuring speculation in the trades that Murnau was only going to Hollywood temporarily to show them how it's done, and he'd be back soon. Others muttered under their breath that he was a traitor. But there is another answer, another explanation. Murnau wasn't selling out, he was grabbing a life preserver. You see, Ufa in 1926 was a sinking ship. The great Erich Palmer, the brilliant producer who'd shepherded the careers of both Murnau and Fritz Lang and so many other great German talents of the silent era, was forced out of the studio. The institutional resources that Ufa had provided Murnau in the past were drying up, their future increasingly bleak. Murnau got out because to stay behind was madness. Why was Ufa failing, you ask? Well, For that, we need to take a quick economics lesson. In the aftermath of World War I, the German economy was in free fall. Consider this. In 1914, there were 4.2 German marks to the American dollar. In 1920, it was up to 65 marks to the dollar. By 1922, it had reached 7,600 marks to the dollar. Over the course of just 1 month, November of 1923, it sank from 630 billion marks to the dollar to the final lowest point, 1.3 trillion. The cost of items could jump during the time you went shopping. Money was printed in 100 billion mark notes, and even still, you needed stacks of them to buy anything. Perhaps you've heard stories of people wheeling around wheelbarrows full of money to buy their groceries. Well, that's true. It sounds horrible, and it was, but the thing of it was, it wasn't horrible for everyone. There were two classes of people who benefited: speculators and rich industrialists with real assets that could soar in value while their debts were virtually erased. And the thing of it is, movie companies were both of these. So during a period of crazy inflation, movie studios like UFA could prosper. But by the mid-1920s, when the government finally stabilized the mark and halted inflation, those same studios were suddenly saddled with debts they never thought they'd have to pay. The money supply choked up, a great many smaller studios just went under. Banks stopped lending to the ones who survived, and UFA had to tighten its belt. And it was at that point along came Fritz Lang's Metropolis. We as cinephiles can sit comfortably in our seats in the theater and laud the maverick tendencies of artists like Fritz Lang and F.W. Murnau, who refused to compromise their creative integrity and never kowtowed to commercial demands. But we have the luxury of not being there when the bills come due. Lang and Murnau had been spending money like water, and on Metropolis, Lang was so profligate and unrestrained that when the film was released, it had no hope of recouping its costs. Now, this would have been bad enough at any time, but it ruined UFA. German studios were also hurting from the unequal competition from Hollywood imports that increasingly dominated German screens domestically. German producers only had a fairly small domestic market to start with when you consider how small Germany is geographically. And the more of that was eaten up by Hollywood imports, the more German filmmakers came to rely on foreign markets. And the biggest foreign market was, in theory, the United States, but actually getting access to that market was all but impossible. A small trickle of non-American films occasionally penetrated the American distribution scene, but only sporadically and never with much success. This was in large part due to the way the Hollywood studios did business with exhibitors. At that point, a fair number of theaters were owned outright by the studios, and those that were nominally independent were tightly connected to the studios in other less direct ways. The major studios would go to the exhibitors and say, if you want the next Charlie Chaplin film or whatever, you need to accept a package of movies along with it. Now, we're not even sure what they are yet. We haven't even made them yet. But we're going to pre-reserve those slots on your schedule now. The practice was called block booking. Foreign companies saw this as fundamentally anti-competitive and started to organize an opposition. They would form trade groups, lobby Congress, they'd buy theater chains of their own, mostly without success. UFA faced the music by signing a deal that would give Paramount and MGM much greater access to German theaters, in exchange for some much-needed cash to keep the UFA lights on. Now, another of the ways in which Hollywood maintained its dominance was to poach the great filmmakers of other countries. This had a dual purpose, the most obvious of which was noted a moment ago, in that they could neutralize their competitors. If Murnau was the kind of filmmaker who could make great movies, he should be making movies for Americans and making money for American companies, not competing against them. But there was another reason why it was a popular strategy. To the extent that the foreigners' complaints were being heard in the press or by legislators, Hollywood's refrain was, "There is no anti-competitive trade practice here, nothing to regulate or forbid. The only reason foreign films aren't being shown in American theaters is because they aren't very good." This was the go-to explanation. Foreign films aren't very good. As it happened, in 1926, this was an argument Hollywood needed to invoke a lot. The Justice Department decided that the whole block booking thing was tantamount to an illegal monopoly. They filed suit against Paramount. A very real threat of government regulation started to terrify Hollywood. And in the courtroom and in the halls of Congress, the studios desperately argued, no, we don't keep foreign films out of American theaters by anti-competitive measures. It's just the foreign films aren't that good. To which the likes of Metropolis and The Last Laugh would be Exhibit A against them. Metropolis and The Last Laugh had gotten a lot of positive critical attention. The world was waking up to the idea that Germany was actually the height of cinematic artistry, not Hollywood. Paramount's deal with UFA was intended in part to secure Lang and Murnau as employees of Paramount. It didn't work. Lang left UFA to start his own company and wouldn't make the move to Hollywood for many years, and Fox managed to sneak in and steal Murnau out for himself. Getting Murnau was a huge public relations win for Fox, partly because he was able to one-up Paramount and get the guy they'd been trying to get. You see, Paramount and MGM were the two biggest, most prestigious studios in Hollywood. They were making expensive, prestigious films the industry liked to call specials. These were films of great technical and artistic accomplishment, hailed by critics as worthy. When Paramount and MGM struck their deal with UFA, their goal was to get access to all that great German talent and put them to work for Paramount and MGM. Meanwhile, William Fox's studio was making its profits mostly from cheap Jack Westerns. He'd been wanting to improve the artistic standing of his studio, and getting Murnau meant he could now boast of having one of the very most respected cinema artists in the entire world. It didn't matter to Fox whether Murnau made any money. He could let Murnau do whatever he wanted to, and no matter what, Fox would win. If Murnau's film was a hit, now of course that would be a happy outcome, but if it wasn't, Fox could honestly say he let one of cinema's true geniuses loose, and if the American people weren't satisfied, that wasn't his fault. Now, there's one other point that ought to be mentioned in this context. At the time that Fox was making these overtures to Murnau, the entire American film market was reeling from a precipitous and unprecedented drop in attendance. The old business models were failing, once solid genres and beloved stars were losing their appeal, and the moguls were worried that things they thought they could take for granted were now in doubt. From today's standpoint, we can look back and see that the film industry has always been through cycles of bearish and bullish markets, like any market. 1926 was just one of many sallow funks to come. But in 1926, that industry was still so young that nobody could say with confidence, oh, we'll get through just fine. Instead, they took to soul-searching. And deep in the inner sanctums of the big studios, an idea was whispered that was never shared with the press. The idea that Hollywood's problem was it made too many sucky movies. Now, there had been some amazing works of art by the likes of Charlie Chaplin and Cecil B. DeMille and D.W. Griffith and F.W. Murnau that had shown audiences what the medium was capable of. But the majority of productions pouring out of the studios were programmatic fare of no ambition and no lasting consequence. The practice of block booking was destroying the industry. I mean, forget the Justice Department's antitrust suit. The problem with block booking was that it made it easy to sell crappy movies and removed the incentive to make good ones. Easily a third of what was being made in Hollywood could have been discarded, and that money could have been added to the budgets of the remainder to try to make fewer, better movies. Now, here's something important. Please understand that this analysis is not film historians like myself looking back in hindsight, although I agree with it. It most certainly was not something debated in public. This was the private, internal thinking of the studio bosses in 1926, as reported in personal communications to historian Benjamin Hampton in 1930. This was top secret stuff. But it was coloring their decision of how to act, and one obvious conclusion that a reasonable person would draw from this kind of analysis is that what a movie studio ought to do to shore up faltering profits is go hire a proven artist and give him carte blanche, which, as we've seen, is exactly what William Fox did. Changing topics, I have to clear up a little confusion over people's names. We have an actor on the left-hand side of the screen with hay sticking out of his teeth. The actor's name is Gwen Big Boy Williams. He was in tons of cowboy horse operas. He was the son of a rancher, stood a full 6 foot 2 inches tall, all of it muscle. He'd been a Major League Baseball player, rodeo rider, and movie stuntman. who got his break in films and his nickname Big Boy from the great Will Rogers. He could play dumb like nobody's business, and since I know you're waiting for me to give his slapstick credentials, I can tell you he's in a lot of silent comedies, perhaps most significantly, the brilliant Ladies' Night in a Turkish Bath with Jimmy Finlayson. And for reasons I can't fathom, he's misidentified in several publications as being the actor playing Mac. Now, the real Mac, of course, is right behind him. With the hat and the mustache, he's played by Richard Alexander. He was on the early end of what would prove to be a wildly varied career that would range from All Quiet on the Western Front to playing Prince Baron in the Flash Gordon cliffhanger serials. His slapstick credentials? Why, he's in Harry Langdon's See America Thirst, as well as Laurel and Hardy's Them Thar Hills and Babes in Toyland. Now, as Mac goes bounding off to barge in on the Tustines' lunch in a brazen effort to come between Kate and Lem and try to claim Kate for himself, I want to return to an idea I broached a little earlier about the recurring theme of the intruder. Tustine perceives Kate as an intruder into his world, a hussy whose values are antithetical to his Bible-thumping killjoy harshness, but in attacking her, he has driven a wedge between her and Lem, which provides the opening for Mac, the true intruder of the story, to make his move. And as if to visualize this explicitly, Mac intrudes into the house, acts like he owns the place. Somehow, this behavior Tustine accepts, whereas Kate's mere presence is intolerable. I point this out because in Murnau's films, the intruders are always welcomed by their victims. Nosferatu the vampire comes to town only because Johannes Hutter goes and sells him a house. Tartuffe only comes to the Organ household because Organ invites him as an honored guest. The man in Sunrise takes up with the woman from the city all on his own. Old Man Tustine has hired the overconfident Mac and then created the conflict with Kate that will inspire Mac to actions that nearly destroy the entire wheat crop and leave Lem for dead, a horror Tustine invites into his own home. And oh my, what a juxtaposition. The men are drooling lasciviously over Kate, whom he brings before them and orders, "Do something to earn your keep." Do what exactly? Is she to serve these men or to service them? And she's going to lose the talisman of her relationship with Lem. It's as symbolic as if the wedding ring had dropped off her finger. Whoever holds on to that fortune ticket thinks of it as holding some claim on her affections too. Now, so far, we've only glanced around the periphery of the talkie version of this film, prepared after Murnau's departure. We'll dig into that version's unique properties a little later on, but I'd like to highlight one of its differences for you here as an appetizer for the conversation to come. Tustine is forcing Kate to play waitress for his men. That word waitress jumped out of the letter and forever branded her in his mind as something inferior, and she accepts this servile role here reluctantly and with resentment. But in the talkie version, that for many decades was the only way anyone saw this film, she willingly takes that role of her own volition. Tustine has nothing to do with it. She volunteers to serve the men so as to lighten the burden on her mother-in-law and says, "Feeding gorillas is my racket." She also coos to Lem how much she enjoys working for him on the farm, that she's so much in love it doesn't even feel like work. Now, if you have a hard time reconciling that with how Kate is presented in this version, you're well on your way to understanding why Murnau was unhappy about surrendering control to the outsiders who came in to make this into a talking picture. International Harvester, the biggest source of industrial farm equipment in the 20th century, sent over a promotional film about their thresher machines that they hoped would help Murnau in staging these sequences. By which I mean to say International Harvester hoped to get some on-screen publicity as the manufacturer of high-quality thresher machines. Certainly Murnau's work with these sequences borders on the documentary, and we can celebrate these moments as the relics of the symphony of wheat that Murnau had once envisioned for this film. Not having the International Harvester film to compare to this, it's hard to say what inspiration Murnau did or did not take from it, but the weird thing is how International Harvester comes up in discussion of other great artists as well. The founder of the company was Cyrus McCormick, and he'd been a patron of Sergei Prokofiev, was partly responsible for Prokofiev premiering The Love of Three Oranges at Chicago's Lyric Opera. McCormick and his company also archived the largest collection of photographs and documents describing 20th century Midwestern life, and that collection is now housed at the Wisconsin Historical Society, where you can see historical images that look a lot like scenes in this film. The photography here is simply astonishing. About 50 years after this was shot, writer-director Terrence Malick and cinematographer Nestor Almendros would revisit much of this atmosphere and imagery for the 1978 film Days of Heaven. It's not a remake, not strictly speaking, because Days of Heaven follows its own trajectory through decidedly different details, but the broad strokes of the canvas are very much the same. A dark-haired beauty from Chicago who comes to a Midwestern grain farm in search of a simpler life. She finds herself the focal point of a love triangle between the owner of the farm and a hired hand, and that sexual tension and jealousy boils over into tragedy and violence when the farm is beset by a biblical calamity. Although Malick maintained the wheat farm setting of this picture, which itself maintained the wheat farm setting of the play, there's a bit of a danger in thinking the setting is more deeply rooted in the story than in fact it is. Murnau said he wanted to make a tale about wheat, but even in his most ambitious ideas for that, he was doodling in the margins. Murnau said his goal was, quote, a story adhering to the stage play The Mud Turtle. And you see, the Mud Turtle of The Mud Turtle is Kate. The title comes from a line of dialogue she has in the play. She complains how Tustine, quote, nagged at me like I was a mud turtle on my back in the mud and he was poking at me with a stick. And you let him do it, she says to Lem. Elliot Lester's story is at its heart one about relationships, not grain. Murnau's proposed title, Our Daily Bread, tried to shift the emphasis, but the release title, City Girl, puts it back on Kate, which is where it was to start with. Really, there's nothing here that couldn't just as well have taken place at a hog farm or a dairy farm, or, for that matter, just about any entrepreneurial business run on a hand-to-mouth basis by a small businessman. The leering farmhands oogle Kate's legs in a mirror image of the scene at the diner earlier, a reminder of how far Kate has come to have not moved at all. Returning to our mystery story, let me recap the story so far. William Fox offered Murnau creative freedom, since the PR boost of having him was worth more than the potential profits of any one film. Murnau took the job because he needed out of the rapidly deteriorating German film industry. They made Sunrise together as a trial run, a sort of cinematic trust but verify, and they came out of it all but in love with each other. So where did it go wrong? William Fox is one of those classically American rags-to-riches success stories, who built a movie empire through true grit and personal endurance. He had an infrastructure of nationwide chains of theaters through which he could release productions starring some of the country's most popular stars. But even at the height of his success, he was running behind Paramount and MGM, and by the mid-1920s he was losing ground. So in 1925, he sat down with his closest advisors, Saul Rogers and Winfield Sheehan, and formulated a strategy to get back on top. The central element of this strategy was to invest heavily in the development of sound recording technology. He had an engineer already by the name of Theodore W. Case, and Fox also bought the patents of inventor Lee DeForest. This was the foundation of Movietone, a sound-on-film process that by 1927 Fox started to roll out, principally in short subjects like two-reel comedies or newsreels. In fact, in an interesting coincidence, the very first ever Movietone program was the premiere of Sunrise at Fox's Times Square Theater in New York on September 23, 1927. There was a Movietone newsreel, and then Sunrise was shown with synchronized music and sound effects, the first ever feature film to have a synchronized soundtrack. Now, meanwhile, Fox's top competitor in the race to sound was Warner Brothers, whose Vitaphone process was similarly used initially on short subjects. The conventional wisdom on the advent of sound focuses on the landmark release of The Jazz Singer and the earthquake it unleashed across Hollywood. But here's the thing, by that point, sound films had been in theaters for a while without triggering any earthquake. Instead, the entire industry still eyed sound warily as a novelty. In order to equip themselves to even screen sound films, theaters had to undertake costly retrofitting that could run upwards of $30,000 per theater. And to make the sound films in the first place, studios needed to abandon their existing plans and invest in entirely new soundproof stages. Nobody was eager to go spend that kind of money until they had to. And Fox and Warner Brothers were spending that kind of money only because they were jockeying for position in a future market whose existence they were only speculating. Fox was winning that race hands down, and he was winning it by using sound very sparingly and making mostly silent features. Warner Brothers decided on a desperate but bold ploy. They made an all-talkie feature film with big musical numbers starring one of the country's top singing stars. This was, of course, the jazz singer, and the gamble worked. In 1926, Warner's was losing millions of dollars a year. After the jazz singer, they were seeing profits of millions. For the industry as a whole, this was the tipping point. Now, all of a sudden, theaters that had been reluctant to switch over to sound did so in droves, which in turn pushed down the costs, making it easier for other smaller theaters to do so too, which created a spiral effect that quickly retrofitted the entire exhibition industry. Having made these investments in new screening technology, those theater owners wanted naturally to prioritize its use, and they started to refuse to book silent films. Fox's movie tone process was now the second runner. To regain his status, he needed to aggressively push movie tone. Bear in mind, movie tone and Vitaphone were not compatible formats, so if a theater equipped for one, it couldn't play the other. So Fox invested major sums in a new studio complex called Movie Tone City. Now, to finance this expansion, Fox took out loans of $30 million. Now, that was just for the Movie Tone City complex. Fox was also buying up theater chains like they were going out of style. All these debts were to come due at the end of 1929, start of 1930. His plan was to repay those loans by selling new shares of stock whose value would be pumped up by the newly expanded production facilities, the sparkly new technology, the new theater outlets. It was a risky plan. And while he was arranging this new round of stock issuance, he was injured in a car crash and hospitalized. His creditors seized this moment of his incapacitation to claim he was in default. This was a hostile takeover. Suits were filed, old friends stabbed each other in the back, the press ate up the juicy gossip, and when the dust settled, William Fox had lost control of his company and was no longer in the movie business. In summary, after the completion of Sunrise, the man who had brought Murnau to America spent his energies pushing sound recording technology. During this period, Murnau kept making silent films. By the time this picture was completed, William Fox was no longer even involved in the story at all. For that matter, although Fox had been the force responsible for hiring Murnau, on a day-to-day basis the filmmaker was actually answering to Winfield Sheehan. Now, Sheehan was a ruthless player, and he sided with the hostile takeover against Fox. Sheehan felt that with all the money going into movie tone and with the obvious direction the market was going, that it was imperative for the studio to turn out sound pictures and nothing but. Murnau had expected Four Devils and Our Daily Bread to be, like Sunrise, silent features with a synchronized soundtrack of music and sound effects. And indeed, Four Devils was finished in just this way and premiered in Murnau's intended version. But at that point, Murnau had already finished with the exteriors of the Tustine farm. They'd sold off the excess wheat. They were shooting the Tustine interiors. In a few weeks, they would begin the scenes at Kate's Diner. And the reaction to the Four Devils premiere was sobering. Silent films now had no viable market. Fox might as well throw Four Devils and Our Daily Bread away rather than try to release them as silents. The Fox studio could afford to let Murnau have his head when the commercial prospects of his films were worth less than the critical boost of having cinema's greatest artist on the payroll. But if Murnau's films were now considered retrograde, then he wasn't earning the same PR benefit, and suddenly the commercial prospects of his films took on a new importance. We have now identified the point where it went awry, because either the studio was going to chuck Four Devils and Our Daily Bread into the garbage bin, or they were going to have to go back and shoot dialogue sequences to retrofit them into being at least part talkies. Now, that happened a fair bit in those days. A good number of pictures that had been completed as silents were then adapted to add in limited dialogue sequences to make them marketable in the new environment. It happened enough that there was an accepted industry protocol for it. Since talking on camera was something absolutely new, it was taken for granted that movie people were not the ones to do it. Instead, studios brought in Broadway people to supervise the dialogue shoots. The technology of early sound film was pretty crude. The cameras were locked in place by boxes intended to baffle the sound of their mechanisms, and there was a cruel irony that while technicians struggled to keep the cameras from making unwanted noise on the soundtrack, it was hard to get the actors' voices to register properly on the enormous microphones that were then hard to hide on the sets. Murnau's reputation as one of the greatest filmmakers of the age had been built on visual artistry. His famously fluid camera work was now hampered by the technology. He was hailed for minimizing or abandoning intertitles, but in talkies that didn't mean a thing. And now his latest creation, The Four Devils, was being flatly rejected for the sole reason it didn't have this gimmick of talk in it. Nobody was even commenting on his artistry. All that mattered was, did Janet Gaynor talk or not? And to get her to talk, he would have to let some Broadway hack take over. Put bluntly, all the things that made Murnau great were now being rejected by the film industry. It must have felt like a slap across the face, and he was going to have to get slapped twice. With Four Devils, it would be a question of going back and doing that part-talky retrofit dance. But Our Daily Bread was still in production. Why bother to finish it as a silent at all? Murnau realized that neither film was going to be released as he'd envisioned. The changes would inevitably involve surrendering control to others, and his benefactor not available to help. The next two films on the contract, why, they'd have to be talkies too. So he quit. Formally tendered his resignation in February of 1929, and he never did make a talkie. There's an aspect of the visualization of this film I'd like to bring to your attention. Throughout the picture, Murnau draws diagonal slashes through the frame. He does so with props and set designs such as staircase banisters or attic slats, or with deep shadows cast across the walls in striking, loping diagonals. They are more noticeable in the second half of the film than in the first, and generally, the film's imagery moves from an opened lightness at the start to an increasingly film noir-like darkness and shadowy night world as it proceeds to the finale. There is a curious effect here, where the thresher is fixed on a stage and behind it there's a rotating platform with a forced perspective model of the buildings in the distance, with the intended effect that we are to perceive it as the exact opposite, a moving thresher and a stationary house. It doesn't quite work that way, but it's so beautiful and strange, I actually find it more alluring and memorable than if it had been 100% convincing. While I've been yammering away, poor Mary Duncan's been acting her little heart out. This is an extraordinary performance she gives in this film. I'm glad of the title change to put the emphasis back on her because she earns it. In his review of the film, French critic Jean-Georges Auriol wrote, "Mary Duncan is the most intelligent woman of the cinema. She has the gift of exceptional insight, intensified at time by troubled intuitions." She's been given a lot of emotional ground to cover. Her character experiences a lot of different feelings, which she conveys absolutely wordlessly. Of course, having said that, when audiences finally saw Mary Duncan in this role, she was talking. The silent version only came to light long afterwards. When he quit, Murnau wrote a letter full of specific enumerated suggestions of how to improve the unfinished film and how to adapt it for sound. Lottie Eisner reprinted the suggestions in her book, and they are fascinating. It is too easy to say that Murnau was stubbornly against sound films. The letter reveals he was quite willing to make the change and putting serious thought into the best way to exploit its dramatic potential. I already said Murnau had hoped to make this film the debut of Fox's new widescreen process, and he tried to use an experimental early version of Technicolor on Taboo. Murnau was a flexible artist who saw all of these new technological advances as worthy tools to add to his toolbox. Murnau felt the best place to start up the talking scenes was with this scene here, the crucial nighttime encounter between Kate and Mac, with so much sexually charged tension and dramatic stakes. Reading between the lines, I think Murnau also felt that this scene could benefit from such a reshoot anyway to enhance that sexual tension. As we shall see, essentially none of Murnau's suggestions were taken. However, it is notable that basically all of the suggestions Murnau made in that letter are about this scene. Either Murnau felt this was the fulcrum of the movie, or he was dissatisfied with what he'd done with it. If talk should be added to the picture, he wrote, I would suggest it start at the final night sequence where the girl sits alone at the table, and all of a sudden Mac, with his wounded hand, steps into the room. But then the talk should go on to the finish. The whole story has been built up to this night. The whole situation is just right for an outburst. And there, the opening would be given through the words. Just there would be the point where talk could be of big dramatic value. Another suggestion goes, quote, in all scenes where Mac appears with the girl, build up the danger, so that in the climax it already has its dangerous background. He goes on to add, quote, on this final evening, the scene between Mac and the girl should be more sensuous, so that we as an audience really fear that the girl might surrender. Murnau was also of the opinion that when the father slapped Kate during their first encounter, it was too big of a dramatic moment to be front-loaded in that way. It would have had greater impact if the slap were held off until this scene. Quote, when the old man catches them both and tells her he is glad he has proof now, we should have the girl forget all her good feelings that might have grown through pure love of the boy. She should become the hard-boiled waitress who is used to fighting men. She should yell at the old man all the truth this old tyrant could be told, of what he's done to her, of what he's done to his son, of what he's done to his whole family. And she should say it in the most bold, vigorous manner, so that the audience is relieved at last there is someone to tell him the truth. As an answer to this, which the old man considers an insult, outraged he would slap her and call her a streetwalker. Finally, Murnau suggests that instead of having her departure through the window of her room something suggested off-screen, it would be better to actually show it. Of course, none of those changes were made to this version, and the sound version made completely different creative choices. Before I detail the differences between the sound and silent versions of City Girl, I ought to explain why a silent version of City Girl exists at all, since I got through telling you that there was no surviving American market for such a thing. Indeed, Fox has no records of the silent version ever being shown in the United States prior to 1970. But the thing of it is, while the jazz singer created the tipping point that rapidly caused U.S. exhibitors to convert to sound, Europe and the rest of the world lingered in the silent era for longer and made the transition more gradually. So for foreign markets, Fox still needed a silent edition, and French reviews like the Jean-Georges Auriol piece I just quoted are very precise in describing the content of the film, such that we can be sure that this version we're watching now matches the silent version distributed outside the US back in 1930. In order to finish the silent version, Catherine Hilliker and H.H. Caldwell were called in. These were two of the most highly regarded and influential title writers in the business, almost a breed apart. They were post-production specialists and serious editors, whose job it was to come in at the end of shoots to fashion the material in the best possible presentation for maximum commercial appeal. In the parlance of modern Hollywood, you'd call them post-production doctors. When I describe them that way, you're probably thinking Hilliker and Caldwell were the kind of studio interference that Murnau bristled at. Actually, that's not the case. Murnau had a professional relationship with Hilliker and Caldwell, dating back to his German period. They'd been adapting his films for American distribution ever since Faust. They were friends with him, they respected one another creatively. Murnau trusted them to see Our Daily Bread through to completion in his absence. Now, they came onto the project in July 1929, already some 5 months after he'd left the studio. First thing they noticed was that they were unhappy with the ending. Unreleasable was the word they used. Unfortunately, it's not entirely clear today what it was they wanted to change about the end, or in fact what it was they did change. They did rewrite the very end of the movie from the moment that Tustine shoots at Lem. We do know that the wheat field was rebuilt in a studio for some reshoots, so it's a reasonable conclusion to draw that the very end of the picture as it now stands, with Lem barely surviving and his father chastened by the near miss, is Hilliker and Caldwell's ending. So what happened in the original unreleased ending? I don't know, and for all I know, this is it. But Hilliker and Caldwell often joked with Murnau for his penchant for tragic endings, so I've a sneaking suspicion that as Murnau filmed it, Tustine shot and killed Lem. Now that sure would have been an unreleasable ending, not just because Americans don't like tragic endings, but because Lem's the only reason the film got released at all. At the point Murnau left, the general feeling at Fox had been that it would be better to just abandon the film rather than throw good money after bad trying to finish it. But then, something happened to change their mind. Charles Farrell had been a rising star at Fox since 1926, and in his pairings with Janet Gaynor was rapidly turning into one of the studio's hottest properties. Winfield Sheehan had long maintained that movie stars were overpaid egotists with a poor work ethic, and the movie business shouldn't be built around such overgrown babies. He didn't get a lot of traction with his anti-movie star philosophy in the silent era, but a fair number of these stars couldn't maintain their image once talking came in. So Sheehan took the opportunity to shed a lot of those performers in favor of ones more beholden to him and more pliable as employees. Charles Farrell was one of his protégés, and among the most prominent and successful of the lot. So now the studio realized they had the better part of a Charles Farrell vehicle already done. All they needed to do was go shoot some talkie scenes for it. As I said before, the established silent film people were considered by definition not qualified for the new sound technology, so Hilliker and Caldwell weren't even asked to contribute to the talkie version. Instead, Murnau's assistant director A.F. Buddy Erickson took over, with the assistance of Broadway's A.H. Van Buren to handle the dialogue staging. And they did so right after performing the same duties on the talkie cut of Murnau's Four Devils. Cinematographer L.W. O'Connell, who had been working with Murnau and director of photography Ernest Palmer all along, was promoted to oversee the new shoot. To write the new talkie screenplay, in came of all people Elliot Lester. So the new team was comprised of people who'd been involved with Murnau and/or this film already. The plan was to have the talking commence not late in the film, as Murnau had suggested, but immediately when the story moved from Chicago to the farm. That is to say, at the point that the movie picked up where the play begins. Elliot Lester was under specific instructions to bring Charles Farrell front and center, which inevitably meant distorting the story. Over the course of 9 drafts, written over 6 months, oh, the poor man, Lester changed the title yet again, this time to Manhood, as he honed in on how best to make Lem the main character of the story. It became about Lem's struggles to prove his manliness to his overbearing father and to the interloper Mac. Kate was shoved to the sidelines and made into a more submissive and weak figure. Now, I haven't had the chance to see the talkie version, so what I'm saying about it mostly comes from what I've read by Janet Bergstrom, as well as what Lottie Eisner and Richard Kozarski wrote about it in the 1970s. From those descriptions, it sounds like Erickson, Van Buren, and Lester did take just one of Murnau's suggestions to heart, and did indeed move the father's slapping of Kate to the finale, but they did so within a version where the tension between Kate, Mac, and the father had been so deracinated that the change didn't achieve much. In the talkie version, Mac freely confesses to Lem that he'd tried to seduce Kate, and she resisted. In the talkie version, Tustine never shoots at Lem at all. The new version was also shorter, a trim 67 minutes compared to this version's healthy 90. Since the new version also was to contain some songs, yep, you heard me, songs, a lot of characterization had to be discarded along the way. These new scenes were filmed at the very end of 1929, with care taken to stage them to intercut with as much footage Murnau had shot as possible. In February of 1930, a full year after Murnau quit, City Girl was released. There was no big premiere, it wouldn't even play in New York for another couple of months. Publicity was muted, neither Murnau nor William Fox were around anymore, and even in its adapted part-talkie form, the thing was something of an atavistic embarrassment for a studio desperately trying to convince the world that movie tone was the future of cinema. Reviews were tepid at best. For the next 40 years, that talkie version was the only one known to exist, and then in 1969, producer Alex Gordon and film historian William K. Everson went spelunking through the archives at Fox and came across the silent version. It was a most pleasant surprise, and in 1970 the closest possible approximation of Murnau's vision was given its belated due. We're deep in the darkness now, but the moment of absolute darkness is yet to come. That moment is the dividing line between the two finales offered up in this film. Speaking of different endings, we've spoken about some of the discrepancies between this silent version and the sound version. The fact that the sound version was scripted by Elliot Lester brings us also back to the question of how this film relates to the play The Mud Turtle. When it opened in August of 1925, The Mud Turtle starred Helen McKellar as Kate, hard-boiled city waitress who falls in love with farm boy Lem. She comes home to his farm where his father emotionally abuses her until she, in anger and vindictiveness, conspires with a farmhand to sabotage the crop. Kate offers her body to Mac if he would break the thresher machines, which he does, but then she backs out of her side of the bargain and refuses to sleep with him. Tustine discovers her, rejecting Mac's advances, and mistakes this for a sign of her purity. And so this moment of ironic misunderstanding provides for her reconciliation with the Tustine family. When Murnau came on, one of the first things to be changed was the characterization of Kate. In his take, she becomes far more noble. Had Murnau depicted her flight from the farm rather than leave it to this note scene here, it would have removed some of the doubt in the audience's mind of whether she might take Mac's bargain. The nature of that bargain is what changes over the course of the different versions. In the play, Kate initiates a deal, but reneges at the end. In this film, Mac merely assumes her compliance to an offer he makes, and in the sound version, Mac makes the deal and then also confesses it to the Tustines himself. Now, I can't let off discussing the 1925 play without telling you that David Landau, the actor who played Old Tustine on stage, made his transition to movies where he too found a slapstick connection. Among his roles in the movies, he starred alongside the Marx Brothers and Thelma Todd in the film Horse Feathers. You knew I couldn't let that one go. Now, one thing you couldn't easily do on a Broadway stage would be to pull off an action set piece like this. This is a very exciting sequence, stitched together from very short clips of film. Most of these shots are just 1 or 2 seconds long. The longer ones max out at just 3 seconds. For a man who built his reputation on letting the camera roll till it ran out of film, this is a bold step into a new direction. 2 men fighting while they're dragged away quite literally by wild horses, and meanwhile a crazy old bastard with a rifle is preparing to shoot them, sight unseen. This isn't Murnau, it's D.W. Griffith. And to top it all off, this is taking place at night in a storm, which gives cinematographer Palmer a chance to show off lighting a scene with handheld lanterns. It is a fair criticism of the film that the storm isn't very well rendered as an on-screen threat. If the characters didn't talk about it in intertitles or show us newspaper headlines, we might not know at all, which isn't in keeping with a director who could tell stories without intertitles. It's generally understood that Murnau's departure from the production came about before he'd finished that aspect, and that the later reshoots chose not to spend any money on special effects. Be that as it may, the nighttime setting and the handheld lanterns provide us with what I've been calling the moment of absolute darkness, the moment that this film has been grinding towards. Tustine shoots at the cart, a thoughtless act of anger and frustration, and shoots out the lantern. He may or may not have killed his own son. There's no way to tell because he just shot out the only source of light. It's a perfect expressionist touch. The emotional darkness overtakes the frame and blots out the image. A man, blinded by rage, blinds himself. David Torrance makes such a great villain. His blue eyes come across so cold and judgmental, but seeing him diminished here is really rather unsatisfying. I like Murnau's idea of having Kate tell him off. That's the kind of cathartic confrontation you want. Having him chastened by his own folly and begging forgiveness, it just doesn't have the same emotional effect. It's like seeing Darth Vader take off his helmet and apologize to Luke Skywalker in Return of the Jedi. Great screen villains shouldn't be apologizing. Plus, I'm not sure what kind of excuse "I wasn't meaning to shoot you" is supposed to be. "Oh, please forgive me, I was trying to murder someone else." "Oh, I was trying to kill one of my employees, son, not you." "Oh boy, is my face red." Awkward. In the 1978 homage, Days of Heaven, let's call it that, we'll call it an homage, the crop is threatened by a plague of locusts. That as the men go out to try to salvage it by burning the bugs, the simmering jealousy between Sam Shepard and Richard Gere boils over and they start tussling, which sets fire to the wheat and things kind of spin out of control from there. I suppose that counts as a spoiler. I'm sorry if I've ruined the film for you, but I bring it up because I want you to think about that aspect of this finale. The threat to the crop, the arguments used to motivate the workers to try to save the crop, because there's another film I'd like to bring into the discussion. 4 years after City Girl was released, finally, the title Our Daily Bread was applied to a motion picture. That Our Daily Bread was written and directed by King Vidor, and mounted as an independent production when MGM decided not to back it. It's a Depression-era tale of a group of out-of-work men who band together to run a communal farm. In the finale, their crops are threatened by drought, but they pull together as a team to save them, desperately working through the nights and days on end to dig an irrigation trench. Although that climax begins somewhat similarly to the end of City Girl, with a desperate nighttime speech by a man trying to motivate a group of reluctant men to get out of bed and work hard to save the farm, what differs is that in Vidor's Our Daily Bread, this pitch only works because the men really are invested in the success of their farm. Their own futures are at stake. Old Tustine has to go around yelling and threatening and bribing his guys to fight off the hailstorm because he's got nothing else to offer. And for my money, that's where this ending veers off track, if only a little. I just can't fathom why the men would agree to go back and finish the job right after Tustine has proven himself willing to have shot them to death in spite. I wasn't aiming at you! That's not the sort of thing an I'm sorry makes right. But to have the film end with the workers walking out and leaving the Tustines ruined would have been plausible at the cost of being a real downer. And that was, of course, where Hilliker and Caldwell differed most pointedly from their friend F.W., was on the subject of happy versus sad endings. Having come to one climax, the film has a second finale to work through, the remaining reconciliation needed on the other side of the moment of absolute darkness. We know that Hilliker and Caldwell rewrote this sequence and that it was shot on a studio set, recreating the Oregon wheat field in November of 1929. What we don't know is how it differs from the version Murnau shot or what was changed. I'm struck by the obvious parallel to the ending of Sunrise. In that film, the woman from the city slinks off away from the farm, rejected and defeated, carried away through the night on a horse-drawn buggy. That sequence is referenced here, but with a pointed twist. This time she's being brought back by the man she's leaving. And it's a really nice way this is played, very subtle and gentle. I mean, you sort of expect Lem to come rushing up and take her triumphantly in his arms and have everything suddenly right with the world, but that would be emotionally false. Instead, Lem picks her up, but leaves her in control. He can take her away if that's what she wants, or she can stay if that's what she wants, but it's about what she wants, what she can forgive. So I would like to take this final moment to summarize the sprawling and admittedly rather messy thesis that I've tried to establish throughout this commentary. It is the conventional understanding of Murnau's time at Fox that the commercial failure of Sunrise precipitated studio interference in the subsequent pictures and that he quit in frustration over that loss of creative control. But I never found that an entirely convincing explanation. Fox continued to gush over Sunrise even after its box office returns started coming in poor, whereas most of the time, if a studio boss thinks that a film fell under expectations, they disown it pretty fast. Furthermore, Murnau proceeded to work on the subsequent pictures in a way that was collaborative and receptive. The positive working relationship evidently continued through to the initial release of The Four Devils in the form Murnau intended, by which point the better part of City Girl was already in the can. And only then did it go wrong, which I attribute to the effect of the sound revolution. The jazz singer meant three things to Fox, all of them problematic for Murnau. One, it meant that theaters stopped booking silent films. Two, it forced Fox to aggressively push Movietone to compete with Vitaphone, such that instead of just writing off those last two silent Murnaus as outliers and letting them stay as art house curiosities, they had to be retrofitted, and that process meant giving over control to another creative team. Thirdly, the financial picture around the Movietone push resulted in William Fox being forced out. And of course that happened after Murnau left, but the forces leading up to it were dominating Fox's attention during the period of Murnau's unhappiness. It was the perfect storm. As Lem and Kate drive through the wheat field in one of the most gorgeous shots of this gorgeous movie, I'd like to finish off by pointing you towards some other resources you may wish to visit to enhance your understanding of this film. Much of what I've been saying about the problems at Fox comes from Benjamin Hampton's 1930 book, History of the American Film Industry. It's an extraordinary work of journalism. It was written at the end of the silent era, and it focuses on the business side of Hollywood. What I really like about it is that it was written before all the various film theorists and pointy heads of academia came along in the coming generations to impose their various spins on the era. It's really unfiltered stuff. I also recommend Cary Seagrave's book, Foreign Films in America. He overstates his case in a couple of places, but overall he's collated some information that isn't easy to find and brought it all together into one coherent narrative. Of course, a lot of the history on the making of this film that I've been telling you comes from Janet Bergstrom's article, Murnau in America. It's been reprinted in a number of different places. You can find it, as I said, in a number of places. Wherever you do, it's one hell of a read. I augmented that with Lottie Eisner's book on Murnau and Richard Kozarski's article on City Girl, published in 1971. And me? Well, my name is David Callett, and it has been a pleasure to watch this terrific movie with you. Thank you for listening.